At family dinner, I asked if my parents had paid for my surgery. They smiled and answered, "We used that money for your brother's wedding. He needed $50,000 for the venue and reception." I slowly set down my fork. "So you still don't know who needs this surgery?" Their faces drained of color. "Who needs it?" At Christmas dinner, my billionaire grandma Evelyn casually said, "So, are you still living in the house I bought you?" And I completely locked up because I don't live in any house at all, Grandma. And when I said that out loud, she slowly turned her head toward my parents, and I watched the color drain right out of their faces as the crystal chandelier over the table threw a warm glow across fine porcelain plates that probably cost more than my monthly rent. And there I was sitting between my mom and dad at Grandma Evelyn's yearly Christmas dinner, trying not to notice the smug little grin on my younger brother Jason's face from across the table, since he's always been the favorite, the golden boy who never does anything wrong in their eyes. When Grandma Evelyn set her wine glass down with a soft, elegant clink and said, "Michael, sweetheart, how are you enjoying the house I bought you? And are the neighbors treating you well?" And it honestly felt like the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees because my fork slipped from my hand and hit the plate while I croaked out, barely audible, "I'm sorry, what house?" As her perfectly groomed eyebrows pulled together in confusion, and she said, "The house I purchased for you 2.5 years ago, honey, the Colonial on Maple Drive. Your mother told me you were struggling with rent, so I paid for it outright and transferred the deed into your name." And my mom Linda went completely ghost white while my dad Frank's hand shook so badly he missed his water glass the first time. And I said slowly, my heart pounding in my ears, "Grandma, I live in a studio apartment above a laundromat on the east side, and I've never owned a house in my life," which left the room so quiet it hurt. Jason froze mid-chew, and Grandma Evelyn's stare shifted from me to my parents with surgical precision as she said coldly, "Linda. Frank. Care to explain?" While my mom opened her mouth then shut it again, and my dad suddenly found the pattern on his plate fascinating. And Grandma Evelyn continued in a calm but deadly voice, "The deed was transferred to Michael R. Carter 2.5 years ago. I have the documents in my study. The house cost me $1.2 million. Which made my head spin because that was a house that should have been mine and I'd never even known it existed. And when she tapped the table once, a warning I'd known my whole life, she said, "Well, I'm waiting." And my mom finally stammered something about a complication before Grandma Evelyn cut her off sharp as a blade and said, "Legal documents don't have complications unless someone causes them. I transferred that deed to Michael's name, not yours and not Frank's." And Jason shifted in his chair without looking at anyone, which caught my attention, so I asked him directly, surprisingly steady despite the anger boiling up, "Jason, do you know something about this?" And my dad jumped in way too fast, telling me not to drag my brother into it, right before Grandma Evelyn stood up, pushing her chair back silently despite being 78, and said, "I'll be right back." Returning 5 minutes later with a manila folder she dropped on the table hard enough to rattle the silverware, pulling out photos and sealed paperwork and saying, "This is the house at 428 Maple Drive." Sliding a photo toward me of a beautiful 3-bedroom colonial with white shutters, a wraparound porch, and a manicured garden that looked like everything I'd ever wanted, then producing another document and saying, "And this is the deed transfer signed and notarized, Michael R. Carter, owner as of December 15th, 2.5 years ago," before staring straight at my mother and adding, "The same day you called me crying about how Michael was about to be evicted and needed help." And I said numbly that I actually had been about to be evicted from my apartment and had called my parents, who told me they couldn't afford to help because they were saving for Jason's wedding, which Grandma Evelyn flatly pointed out she had also paid for to the tune of $89,000, turning Jason's face bright red as she said it wasn't unfair to bring it up at Christmas, but that what was truly unfair was buying one grandchild a house and letting someone else steal it. And when my mom burst into clearly fake tears, Grandma Evelyn snapped, "You forged his signature, didn't you?" Prompting my dad to claim they used a power of attorney I signed in college for medical emergencies, which made it all click as I said, "You transferred my house into Jason's name," realizing he'd been living there for 2.5 years, and to his credit Jason admitted quietly that he didn't know at first and only found out 6 months ago after seeing paperwork in Dad's office, and when I asked why he didn't tell me, he said Dad warned it would tear the family apart and that I was doing fine without it. Which made me let out a bitter laugh because doing fine meant working 2 jobs to afford a tiny 400-square-foot studio with black mold in the bathroom, eating ramen most nights, and skipping the dentist for 2 years because I simply couldn't afford it. "But yeah, Jason, I'm doing just great. I said bitterly as Grandma Evelyn calmly lowered herself back into her chair, every movement measured, before fixing my parents with a hard stare and saying, "Frank, Linda, here's what's going to happen next. You have exactly 48 hours to transfer the deed of that house into Michael's name, spelled correctly this time, with no games, no loopholes, and no sudden complications." And when my mom protested that Jason lived there and had a job nearby and a fiancé to consider, Grandma Evelyn shut that down instantly by saying they should have thought of all that before stealing from their own child, making it crystal clear there would be no negotiation as she added, 48 hours or my attorneys will pursue criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and theft, and I don't care if it's Christmas, which made my dad plead in a voice I'd never heard before, saying she couldn't do this because Jason's wedding was in 4 months and the house address was already printed on the invitations, only for Grandma Evelyn to reply flatly that Jason better find a new address fast, then turning to me with a softer look and telling me I'd stay with her until everything was resolved and that my old room was exactly the way I'd left it. And standing there I suddenly understood that the summers the first used to spend at her estate before my parents slowly pushed me away weren't about family bonding at all but about cutting me off from the one person who would have protected me. So I looked at my mom and asked quietly how she could do this to me when I was her son, and she said Jason needed it more like that, explained everything, telling me I'd always been independent and capable and that they knew I'd figure things out while Jason needed help getting started, which made me say, tasting every bitter word, "So you gave him my house, something Grandma gave me out of love, and handed it to your favorite child." And when my dad snapped that I was being dramatic and it wasn't like I'd been homeless, I shot back that I almost had been multiple times, asking if they had any idea how many nights I sat in my car trying to decide whether my last $20 should go toward gas to get to work or food, my voice cracking as I reminded them I'd begged for help and been told they couldn't afford it and that I just needed to budget better, only for my mom to weakly claim they were teaching me responsibility, which I answered by saying they were stealing from me while lying straight to my face. And as I stood up on shaky legs with my mind made up, Jason pushed his plate away and said he'd move out and apologized, swearing he didn't know the truth for the first 2 years, and when I pointed out he'd known for the past year and stayed quiet, he admitted that still made him complicit and promised he'd be gone by the end of the week, which made Grandma Evelyn raise an eyebrow and clarify that while Jason could take a reasonable amount of time to move his things, the deed transfer itself was non-negotiable and still due within 48 hours, and as my dad's face flushed red and he argued that we were family and could fix this without threats, Grandma Evelyn agreed calmly that we were family and that was the only reason they weren't already facing police involvement, prompting my mom to shriek in disbelief about being arrested, only for Grandma Evelyn to coldly explain that using my medical power of attorney to transfer over $1 million in property was a felony, and with dinner completely ruined, Jason excused himself claiming he needed air while my parents sat frozen, finally grasping what they'd done, and I asked Grandma Evelyn for copies of every document and piece of proof for my own records, surprised by how steady my voice sounded, which she promised to arrange first thing in the morning before I added that I wanted to see the house and walk through what should have been mine for the last 3 years, something she eagerly agreed to while also mentioning she'd have her attorneys review everything in case my parents had pulled any other stunts, which immediately raised red flags because she then explained she'd made several financial gifts over the years meant for both me and Jason, including college funds and investments, and wanted to confirm they ended up where intended, making my mom choke while I asked quietly what else they'd taken. And even though my dad insisted nothing else was missing and my mom tried to claim my college fund mostly went to college, Grandma Evelyn pressed until the silence told the truth and my mom admitted some of it had been reallocated for Jason's wedding, which led me to say slowly that I graduated with $70,000 in student loans because they told me Grandma had overestimated the fund, causing Grandma Evelyn to reveal she'd put $150,000 into that account, leaving $80,000 unaccounted for. Money I realized had gone to Jason's wedding while I'd been paying $700 a month in loans for 2.5 years, over $21,000 I should never have owed. And when my dad rushed to promise they'd pay me back with more time, I laughed and reminded them they'd already had 3 years, spent my money, and given away my house, making it painfully clear that what they did with their own money suddenly mattered very much, something Grandma Evelyn firmly agreed with, as she stepped in and took control of the room once again. "Every dollar you stole from Michael is his business," Grandma Evelyn said firmly, turning to me and promising she'd have forensic accountants comb through everything, every single gift she'd ever made with my name attached, And over the next 2 days the truth came out in a way that honestly felt like living through a nightmare because her lawyers and accountants worked fast and without mercy, uncovering not just the house and my college fund but also a $20,000 savings bond she bought me for my 16th birthday that my parents cashed in to remodel their kitchen, a trust account meant to vest when I turned 28 worth about $60,000 that they quietly shifted into Jason's name, and stocks Grandma Evelyn had bought for me worth roughly $40,000 that they sold while claiming they were managing my portfolio, bringing the total to around $420,000, nearly $500,000 my own parents had taken from me over 15 years. And on the second night I sat in Grandma Evelyn's study staring at stacks of documents spread across her mahogany desk feeling completely hollow because at 28 years old I was realizing almost $500,000 had been stolen from me across my entire life. And I finally said out loud that I'd always wondered why they seemed to resent me, why nothing I ever did was good enough while Jason could do no wrong. And Grandma Evelyn said it was guilt, pouring herself a scotch and explaining that it's easier to steal from someone if you convince yourself they don't deserve what you're taking, which made me ask in a smaller voice than I meant to whether they ever loved me at all. And she sat across from me and said maybe in their own broken way they did, but they loved money and status more. That Jason's wedding impressed their friends and the house she bought me probably felt wasted on a son they'd written off as too independent to need help, and I cracked saying I did need help, that I needed them so many times, and when I asked why she never checked on me or called or visited, something I'd wondered for years, her face twisted as she admitted my parents told her I wanted space and was angry and didn't want to see her, that my mom said I'd call when I was ready, and she respected what she thought were my wishes, which hit me hard because I told her I never said that and that I'd called twice over the years only to be told she was busy, and would call back, calls she never returned, and when she realized she never got those messages her hands tightened around her glass and she said Linda must have intercepted them, knowing the truth would come out if we talked. And suddenly everything made sense, the isolation, the broken connections, the way my struggles were always dismissed, because my parents had deliberately cut me off from the one person who could help while stealing from me to fund Jason's life. And on the third day Jason moved out of the house on Maple Drive while I stood in the driveway with Grandma Evelyn watching movers haul furniture away, Jason awkwardly admitting some of the stuff was probably mine and I told him to keep it because I didn't want anything tied to this mess. And he apologized again saying he should have spoken up sooner, which I agreed with even though I wasn't ready to forgive him and didn't know if I ever would, because the truth was his betrayal hurt almost as much as my parents, especially remembering how close we used to be, teaching him to ride a bike, helping him with algebra, defending him when kids mocked his stutter, memories that now felt poison knowing he chose comfort over honesty, and when I asked if he ever thought about me while living there and throwing parties and sleeping in the master bedroom, wondering if he ever pictured me freezing in that apartment with roaches and a broken heater, he admitted he tried not to think about it, and when I asked what our parents said about me at dinners in my house, he told me they painted me as proud and stubborn, choosing to struggle, and he believed them because it was easier than admitting his life was built on theft. And after a mover called him away I stood there realizing I was watching a life that should have been mine 3 years earlier slip by, until Grandma Evelyn rested a hand on my shoulder and told me I was handling it with grace even though I admitted I felt angry, betrayed, and like I didn't recognize anyone anymore, and she reminded me my parents raised me to doubt myself and that undoing that damage would take time, which hit hard because part of me still wondered if I was overreacting or should just forgive and move on, the result of years of gaslighting, and I told her I kept thinking about all the times I called them when my car broke down, when I was sick and couldn't afford a doctor, when my rent went up and I didn't know how I'd survive. And every time they had excuses, saying they were busy or broke or that I had to figure it out myself, all while sitting on hundreds of thousands they'd stolen from me. And I admitted I truly believed I was the problem, bad with money and irresponsible, working myself into the ground trying to prove I could make it alone. Memories surfacing that hurt physically, like the winter my heat got shut off because I couldn't pay the bill. I slept in 3 layers of clothes with every blanket I owned piled on top of me, and I still froze, ended up getting pneumonia. And when I called my mom from the emergency room, you know what she said, so Grandma Evelyn asked what, and I told her she said I should have dressed warmer and taken better care of myself, which made me let out a bitter laugh because I was lying in a hospital bed with a 104-degree fever, and she somehow made it sound like it was my fault for being careless, all while Jason was living comfortably in a house with central heating, which Grandma Evelyn reminded me was legally mine. And when I asked how anyone forgives something like that, I wasn't being dramatic, I genuinely needed an answer. And after a pause Grandma Evelyn said she didn't think you do, That some things simply aren't forgivable, and the real question isn't about forgiveness but whether you can still build a good life in spite of what was done to you. And just then Jason came out of the house holding a box of photo albums, hesitating when he saw us before saying there were family pictures inside and he wasn't sure if I'd want copies. And I thought about Christmas mornings, birthdays, vacations, graduations, memories that now felt like lies, moments frozen before I knew the truth. So I told him to keep them because those people didn't exist anymore. But he set the box down anyway and said he'd keep copies for himself and that I should have the originals, maybe not now but someday when I might want to remember when things were different. And I corrected him by saying things were never different, I just didn't know the truth yet. And after hesitating he left the box on the porch instead of taking it with him, saying I could decide later. And once he drove away I sat on the porch steps and opened it, seeing a photo of me at 7 years old, gap-toothed and smiling with Jason as a toddler on my lap, both of us looking happy. And for a moment I wondered if that little kid really had loved her baby brother without knowing that 20 years later he'd choose a house over her well-being. So I closed the box without looking at anything else because some wounds don't need reopening. And after that I walked through the house alone, taking in the 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, the granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, a carefully tended garden, and a master bedroom big enough for a king-size bed and a reading nook, realizing this should have been my life, that I should have been building something here instead of barely surviving in a moldy studio while Jason hosted dinner parties. And the anger nearly swallowed me whole, but Grandma Evelyn's lawyers moved fast and without mercy, and by the end of the week the deed was officially in my name with no disputes. A lawsuit was filed against my parents for fraud, theft, and breach of fiduciary duty, every stolen dollar documented by forensic accounting, and a court-ordered no-contact agreement put in place so they couldn't reach me except through attorneys, though my mom still tried through social media, swinging between apologies and accusations, saying they only did what they thought was best, that Jason needed help and I was strong enough to survive, begging me not to tear the family apart over money, which is why I blocked her everywhere. And when my dad tried guilt instead by having his sister call and claim the stress was giving him chest pains and ask if money was worth losing my family, I hung up and blocked that number too. And as the lawsuit moved forward my parents hired a lawyer, but Grandma Evelyn's legal team overwhelmed them, tracing every transaction and sealing every argument until even their own lawyer advised settling. And after 6 brutal months they agreed to repay $420,000 plus interest, cover all my student loans, issue a public statement admitting fraud, and give up any future claim to Grandma Evelyn's estate. Negotiations that were ugly and exhausting, with their lawyer trying to frame me as greedy and vindictive and insisting family matters should stay private, only for Grandma Evelyn's attorney, Catherine Mills, to dismantle every excuse by calmly reminding them their clients committed repeated fraud over 15 years, and were only avoiding prison because Grandma Evelyn preferred mercy. And watching my parents across that table, they looked smaller than I'd ever seen, visibly aged, my mom's face lined and my dad's hair nearly gray. Yet when their lawyer claimed it was just an internal family reallocation with no criminal intent, Catherine shut it down by pointing out they used a medical power of attorney I signed at 19 to steal over $1 million, calling it premeditated fraud. And when my mom weakly claimed they were just trying to help both children, Catherine told her coldly that helping one child doesn't give you the right to steal from another. And I sat through it, all mostly silent, occasionally feeling flickers of pity until I remembered the cockroaches, the hunger, and the shame of declined credit cards while they lived comfortably on my stolen future. And that pity never lasted long, especially when their lawyer finally tried yet another angle. "Michael, surely you understand your parents acted out of love," their lawyer said carefully. "They were trying to give Jason a strong start in life." And I answered without hesitation that they didn't give Jason a start at all, they stole mine and handed it to him instead. And when the lawyer pushed back by saying I'd turned out fine and was clearly resilient and capable, implying my parents must have known I didn't need help, Catherine Mills slammed her hand on the table and cut him off cold, telling him not to finish that sentence and making it clear that my resilience in spite of being robbed wasn't a justification but proof of how much more I could have done if I'd had what was rightfully mine. And while he backed down I could see him scribbling notes, already planning to argue that my survival meant I wasn't harmed, which is when I surprised everyone by saying I wanted to speak, the room going dead quiet as I explained this was never about money but about trust, family, and years of lies, locking eyes with my mother as I reminded her of the night when I was 23, and called her sobbing because my apartment had been robbed and my laptop, phone, and the $200 I'd saved for rent were gone, asking if she remembered what she said, her face collapsing because she did, and I repeated her words calmly, that these things happen, I needed to lock my doors better, and she couldn't help me financially because she just paid for Jason's car repairs, before pointing out what she never mentioned was the $60,000 trust fund she had access to. That belonged to me and that she later stole, cutting her off when she tried to speak and turning to my father to remind him how at 25 I'd gotten a job offer in another city with better pay and real opportunity but couldn't afford the security deposit or moving costs, how I'd asked him to borrow just $1,000 and promised to repay it within 3 months, how he told me money was tight and I should stick it out where I was, forcing me to stay in a dead-end job for 2 more years while that opportunity went to someone else, and then letting the silence stretch as I said the truth. That money wasn't tight at all because they'd just taken $80,000 from my college fund to pay for Jason's wedding. The only sound in the room, the hum of the air conditioner as I explained this, was what it was really about, that every time I struggled and reached out they had the means to help and chose not to, that they didn't just steal my money but stole years of my life, my security, my chances, and my ability to trust the people who were supposed to love me. And while my mother cried openly, I felt nothing as I told them this wasn't a misunderstanding or a family disagreement but hundreds of deliberate choices to let me suffer while enriching my brother with stolen money, leaving their lawyer and my parents completely silent. And 2 weeks later the settlement was finalized with my mother sobbing through the signing, and my father wordlessly putting his name where indicated, hissing afterward that she hoped I was happy because I'd destroyed the family. To which I calmly replied that she destroyed it when she stole from me and I was only making sure the truth was known. And once the public statement came out it rippled through their social circle, exposing that Jason's lavish wedding had been funded with money stolen from his sister, a humiliation that hit hard enough to postpone the wedding when his fiancé's old money family learned the truth, leading to the engagement ending 2 months later. And when Jason called me drunk and furious asking if I was satisfied now that his life was ruined, I told him plainly that his life fell apart because he lived in comfort on stolen money and said nothing, and that choices have consequences. And that spring I finally moved into the house on Maple Drive with Grandma Evelyn helping me furnish it because she insisted I deserved a clean start. Yet the first night I couldn't sleep and wandered from room to room touching walls that should have felt familiar but didn't, knowing the house was legally and rightfully mine yet feeling like I was wearing someone else's clothes. Ending up in the master bedroom staring at the empty space where Jason's bed had been, the carpet still marked from 3 years of his life lived there while I struggled, and the anger slammed into me so hard I had to sit on the floor and finally broke down, sobbing harder than I had since childhood as everything I'd held together through lawsuits and negotiations crashed all at once, realizing every birthday card signed with love, every holiday phone call asking how I was doing, had been a performance because they knew exactly how I was doing since they engineered my struggles. And scrolling through old texts I found one from 2 years earlier sent late at night saying my car had broken down on the highway, the repairs were $800, and I was begging for help, followed by my mother's reply, claiming they were stretched thin and suggesting I ask my boss for an advance, a lie that forced me into a predatory payday loan and months of financial hell I never should have endured. Meanwhile, my parents were sitting on money they'd stolen from me, and another message from 3 years ago flashed through my head, one where I'd texted that I'd been accepted into a professional certification program I'd told them about, that it cost $3,000 and would seriously help my career, asking if they could loan me half while I saved the rest, and my mom had replied how wonderful that was but they really couldn't spare the money and maybe it was a sign I should focus on what I already had instead of reaching for more. And because of that I lost the opportunity while someone else in my cohort got the certification and was promoted 6 months later into a job I'd wanted. All because I didn't have $3,000 while my parents were sitting on hundreds of thousands they'd taken from me, and my phone slipped from my hand as I lay down on the carpet in the grooves left by my brother Ben's furniture, and stared at the ceiling until Grandma Eleanor found me there about an hour later after letting herself in with a spare key because I hadn't answered her goodnight call. And she sat beside me with a grace that didn't match her age and said softly that it was finally hitting me, and I whispered that I couldn't stop thinking about all the times I'd needed my parents, all the times I begged for help and they said no while watching me struggle, and she gently corrected me by saying they did worse than nothing because they actively cut me off from her so I couldn't get help, isolating me on purpose. And when I asked why in a voice that sounded way too small why they hated me so much, she told me they didn't hate me, they just loved Ben more, explaining that some parents have favorites and it's ugly and unfair and damages everyone involved, And when I asked if I wasn't good enough or if I'd done something wrong, she told me firmly that I hadn't, that I was simply born second and for certain kinds of parents that alone decides your worth, adding that my mother had always resented her financial success and likely saw me as an extension of her, independent and capable, while Ben reminded her of herself needing support and validation, so she poured everything into him while trying to save herself. And when I said that wasn't fair, Grandma Eleanor agreed and helped me sit up, reminding me that none of this was fair but that their choices said everything about them and nothing about my value. And over the next few weeks she helped me turn the house into my own by painting walls in colors I'd always loved, hanging art I'd admired but never imagined owning, and insisting I start therapy because betrayal like this doesn't heal on its own, which is how I ended up with Dr. Lisa Moore, a therapist who specialized in family trauma and financial abuse, and in our first session I spent nearly an hour listing everything my parents had done while she listened and took notes before explaining that what I experienced was severe parental narcissism mixed with financial exploitation, that I'd been used as a resource to benefit the golden child and gaslighting and isolation were tools to keep control, and when I asked if it was normal that I still loved my parents, she said it was completely normal because I hadn't stopped loving them, I'd stopped believing in the fantasy of who I thought they were, and that distinction mattered, and therapy slowly helped me untangle the mess as memories from childhood resurfaced and suddenly made sense, like the time in high school when I won a scholarship and ran home proud only for my mom to mention that Ben was struggling and needed a tutor they couldn't afford, somehow leaving me feeling guilty for succeeding, or when I got my first job at 16 and proudly showed them my paycheck only for my dad to suggest I contribute to household expenses, handing over half my pay for 2 years while Ben never paid a dime. And once I knew to look for it, the pattern was impossible to ignore because anything good that happened to me was minimized or redirected to benefit Ben while my struggles were treated as my fault and his struggles demanded family support. And the garden became my refuge where I discovered I was good at growing things, tomatoes and herbs and flowers exploding with color, every seed feeling like reclaiming something stolen. And about a year after I moved in, roughly 18 months after that Christmas dinner, my parents showed up unannounced looking older and worn down, my dad stiffly apologizing and asking if we could move past it because they were still my parents, and standing on the porch of the house they'd stolen from me, I felt nothing but exhaustion as I told them they weren't sorry for what they did, only for getting caught, and when my mom reached for me and begged, I stepped back and listed exactly what they'd done, stealing from me, lying to me, isolating me from Grandma Eleanor, letting me suffer while Ben lived comfortably, and handing him every opportunity meant for me, shaking my head and telling them those weren't mistakes but years of deliberate choices, and when my dad insisted we were still family, I told him firmly that we only shared blood, because family doesn't steal, manipulate or gaslight, and that they were strangers who happened to share my DNA, nothing more, before closing the door and watching through the window as they stood there for a long moment and finally walked away. That was the last time I ever saw my parents face to face, and Grandma Eleanor lived another 4 years after everything finally came into the open, years where we rebuilt the bond my parents had tried so hard to erase as she taught me about investing and business, shared family stories I'd never been allowed to hear, and treated me like the grandson she'd always wanted to truly know. And when she passed, she left her entire estate to me, $53 million plus properties and investments, with a will that spelled out clearly that my parents and Ben had already received their inheritance through the money they stole from me, and were entitled to nothing else, which of course they challenged only to have the case tossed out in less than a month with a judge who had some very sharp words about parents who would defraud their own child, and I used part of that inheritance to start a foundation for young women who'd been financially abused by their families, because once you start looking you realize how common stories like mine really are. How many daughters are stripped of opportunity to fund golden sons, how many women struggle quietly while their families live comfortably on stolen money. And in 7 years the foundation has helped more than 3,000 women with legal aid, financial counseling, housing support and education funding, everything I desperately needed when I was on my own. And Ben reached out when I turned 36 saying he'd gotten sober, done the work, and wanted to apologize properly without asking for forgiveness. So we met for coffee and he looked different somehow, smaller and humbler, admitting he'd been a coward who stayed silent because he was comfortable and benefited from theft. And when I reminded him he knew for a full year, he agreed and said that silence made him complicit in everything our parents did. And I studied his face expecting excuses but found only real remorse, telling him honestly I didn't know if I could forgive him but appreciated him owning it. And he said he didn't expect forgiveness, only wanted me to know he understood he'd taken more than money or a house but my sense of safety, trust, and peace, even my relationship with our parents. And now we talk occasionally in a distant but civil way while he tries to make amends through action by volunteering at the foundation and sharing his story as a warning. While I haven't spoken to my parents in 8 years and only hear through relatives that they moved to Florida and downsized after paying the settlement, with my mom still telling people I'm cruel and ungrateful and my dad refusing to mention me at all. And when people ask if I regret the lawsuit or wish I'd handled it quietly to preserve the family, I tell them the truth, that my family was destroyed the moment my parents decided I was worth less than my brother, and all I did was make sure the truth was known. And now the house on Maple Drive is full of light as I got married 2 years ago to a man who believes the foundation is the most important work in the world, and we're expecting our first child in the spring. A daughter who'll grow up knowing her great-grandmother through stories and photos and learning that Eleanor was a woman who didn't tolerate injustice and stood up for what was right even when it meant opposing her own children. And she'll know her father learned to do the same. And every Christmas I hang a framed photo of Grandma Eleanor above the fireplace, taken just moments before that dinner that changed everything, where she's laughing with sharp eyes full of warmth. And while some might see pain in that image, I see a reminder that truth is always worth chasing, that justice matters even when it's uncomfortable, and that some betrayals don't need forgiveness to be survived. So every year I raise a glass in the house she bought me, surrounded by a life built from the wreckage of lies, and whisper thank you for seeing me, believing me, and refusing to let them get away with it. And though the photo never answers, in the reflection of the glass I can almost see her approving smile.